To outsiders, James Craig Kaler seemed like a success story. Born in Kansas in 1963, he worked his way up through the ranks of municipal utilities, eventually becoming Director of Water and Light in Columbia, Missouri. By the time he was in his mid-40s, he had built a respectable career, had a beautiful home, and a seemingly stable family with his wife Karen and their 3 children, Emily, Lauren, and Sean. But appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface, the Kaler home was strained by years of emotional tension, unspoken resentment, and control. Friends and colleagues would later describe Craig as detail-oriented, focused, and professional, but also rigid and increasingly volatile. Karen, a soft-spoken and caring woman, had begun to feel suffocated in the marriage. She was the primary caretaker for their children, but over time, the emotional abuse became overwhelming. By 2008, the couple's relationship had fractured beyond repair. It was in Weatherford, Texas, that the final unraveling began. Craig had taken a job there before relocating the family to Missouri. While in Texas, Karen began working as a personal trainer, where she met Sonny Reese, a fellow fitness instructor. What began as a friendship evolved into a romantic relationship, one that Karen kept secret from Craig initially. When he eventually discovered the affair, his reaction wasn't one of immediate fury, but rather unsettling acceptance. Witnesses later testified that Craig had even encouraged a 3-way sexual relationship in hopes of keeping his marriage alive. By January 2009, Karen filed for divorce. She also sought a restraining order against Craig after alleging physical abuse. In a petition for protection, Karen described him as controlling and forceful, admitting that she sometimes complied with his sexual demands to avoid confrontations. One incident, occurring on March 16, 2009, resulted in Craig being charged with third-degree domestic assault after an alleged attack where he cornered Karen, grabbed her in a bear hug, and left bruises. The charge was pending at the time of the murders. As the divorce proceedings continued, Craig began unraveling. He was obsessed with winning back Karen and increasingly resentful of her relationship with Reese. He stalked Karen online, monitored her communications, and once sent Reese a text message saying, "She doesn't love you, not like you think she does." He missed work, became erratic, and was eventually forced to resign from his job in Columbia due to his personal issues. Karen, meanwhile, had moved with the children to her grandmother Dorothy White's home in Burlingame, Kansas. She wanted a fresh start. Emily, then 18, and Lauren, 16, were thriving academically and socially. Sean, the youngest at just 10, idolized his mother and older sisters. But the peace of Dorothy's quiet home would soon be shattered. In emails and conversations with friends, Karen expressed fear for her safety. She worried Craig's obsession might turn violent. She was right. By late November 2009, Craig Kaler had reached a psychological breaking point. Unemployed, divorced, and emotionally shattered, he packed up a semi-automatic rifle, multiple loaded magazines, and drove to Burlingame to confront the family he believed had betrayed him. The weekend after Thanksgiving was supposed to be a time of warmth and family. Instead, it would become one of the most brutal family annihilation cases in Kansas history. November 28, 2009, was a cold, quiet Saturday in Burlingame, Kansas. Inside the modest home of 89-year-old Dorothy White, Karen Kaler and her 3 children were winding down the Thanksgiving weekend. Emily, a college freshman, had come home to visit. Lauren, 16, was still in high school and was described as bright and spirited. 10-year-old Sean was playing with coins in the kitchen with his mother when the front door suddenly opened. James Craig Kaler stepped inside. He was armed with a .223 caliber Mac and 90 semi-automatic rifle, carrying multiple loaded magazines. Sean, stunned and frightened, testified years later that his father walked into the kitchen and, without hesitation, shot Karen. She collapsed in front of her son. Sean, in a moment of instinctive fear, ran. He ducked behind the kitchen counter, bolted through the door, and sprinted outside to get help. Meanwhile, Craig continued his rampage. Emily was shot in the living room and died at the scene. Lauren, wounded but alive, managed to crawl to a phone and call 911. Her desperate screams could be heard in a chilling recording played during the trial. "Somebody's going to kill us. He's in the house." Craig then turned the gun on Dorothy White. The 89-year-old grandmother was sitting in her recliner. She was shot in the abdomen but survived long enough to identify Craig as the shooter to first responders. Deputy Nathan Perling of the Osage County Sheriff's Office was the first officer on the scene. He found White conscious but bleeding. Upstairs, he found Lauren, gravely wounded, begging, "Don't let me die. I don't want to die." He comforted her until medics arrived. Emergency responders rushed Dorothy, Karen, and Lauren to Stormontvale Hospital in Topeka. Despite medical efforts, all three would die within days. Dorothy survived the longest, finally succumbing to her injuries 3 days later. Outside the house, neighbors Trevor Gibson and Michelle Davidson had noticed a suspicious red Ford Explorer parked on their street earlier that day. When they saw a man return to the vehicle carrying an unknown object, they called 911. That vehicle was later confirmed to be registered to Craig Kahler. The rifle box, ammunition, and a business card with Kahler's name were later found inside. By nightfall, a manhunt was underway. Law enforcement agencies from multiple counties, including the Kansas Highway Patrol and Topeka Police, were searching the woods and rural roads surrounding Burlingame. 13 hours later, at dawn the next morning, Craig was spotted walking along a ditch by a Shawnee County deputy. "I'm the guy you're looking for," he said, surrendering without resistance. He was found carrying knives, a revolver, survival supplies, and hundreds of dollars in cash. The weapon used in the murders, the MAC-90 rifle, was never recovered. Sean Kahler, just 10 years old, would later testify in court about the horror he witnessed. His courage helped bring clarity to a community stunned by the incomprehensible. And the trial of James Craig Kahler, now charged with capital murder, was just beginning. The trial of James Craig Kahler began in August 2011, nearly 2 years after the murders. Held in Osage County District Court in Lindon, Kansas, the courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and grieving family members. At the center sat Kahler, now a gaunt, pale figure in a bulletproof vest, charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and aggravated burglary. The stakes were clear: if convicted, Kahler could face the death penalty. Prosecutors from the Kansas Attorney General's office, led by Amy Hanley and Osage County Attorney Brandon Jones, presented a chilling narrative. They argued that Kahler, humiliated by his wife's lesbian relationship and spiraling personal failures, deliberately and methodically slaughtered his family over Thanksgiving weekend. But the story was more complex. The defense, led by veteran attorney Tom Haney, admitted that Kahler had committed the killings, but claimed he was legally insane. To support their argument, the defense called multiple witnesses. One of the most striking testimonies came from Dr. Stephen Peterson, a psychiatrist hired by the defense. Peterson claimed Kahler suffered from severe depression, paranoia, and dissociative episodes. He testified that Kahler was so mentally impaired that he couldn't distinguish right from wrong at the time of the shootings. But prosecutors countered with their own expert, Dr. William Logan, who stated that while Kahler showed signs of mental stress, he was fully capable of premeditation. Logan pointed out that Kahler had packed survival gear, extra magazines, and cash before the attack, clear signs, he said, of planning rather than psychosis. Perhaps the most devastating witness was Sean Kahler, the couple's 11-year-old son. Testifying via closed-circuit video to avoid being in the same room as his father, Sean described in haunting detail the moment his dad entered the kitchen and shot his mother. He spoke about running for help, seeing his sisters for the last time, and hearing the screams from upstairs. Then came Sunny Reese. Subpoenaed by both the prosecution and defense, she painted a picture of a deeply troubled marriage. She testified that Karen was terrified of Craig, that she had witnessed verbal abuse, and that Karen feared for her life in the months leading up to the murders. Reese also confirmed that Craig had suggested a 3-way sexual relationship as a way to salvage their failing marriage, a claim that prosecutors used to illustrate his unraveling grip on reality. Other witnesses included Karen's divorce attorney, Dan Pingleton, who confirmed she had filed a protective order and that Craig had stalked her online and in person. Investigators detailed the evidence found in Kayla's abandoned red Ford Explorer, survival gear, ammunition, and a rifle box labeled for the exact caliber used in the shootings. Although the murder weapon was never recovered, the physical evidence tied Kayla directly to the crime. The jury listened to emotional 911 calls. They heard Lauren's final words as she lay dying, identifying her father as the shooter. They saw photos of the crime scene and heard from EMTs and deputies who had responded to the chaotic aftermath. Over 2 weeks of testimony, both sides laid bare the rise and collapse of the Kayla family. The prosecution focused on the deliberate nature of the killings, the planning, and the devastating consequences. The defense stressed mental illness, emotional breakdown, and years of toxic family dynamics. In closing arguments, Amy Hanley urged the jury not to be swayed by emotional manipulation. He knew what he was doing, she said. He executed his family. Tom Haney, however, pleaded for understanding. This is not a monster, he said. This is a man who broke. The case was now in the jury's hands, and a life hung in the balance. The courtroom in Lyndon, Kansas, was packed with media, law students, and townspeople by the time Craig Kayla's capital murder trial began in August 2011. It had been nearly 2 years since Thanksgiving weekend of 2009, when Kayla murdered his wife, Karen, their 2 daughters, Emily and Lauren, and Karen's grandmother, Dorothy White. Now, the state of Kansas sought the death penalty for the former city utilities director whose life had spiraled from professional acclaim to unimaginable bloodshed. The trial opened with a chilling account of the murders. Prosecutors Amy Hanley and Brandon Jones did not mince words. In her opening statement, Hanley said, "This was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated execution." She detailed how Kayla had driven from Meriden to Burlingame on the evening of November 28, 2009, entered the White family home, and systematically gunned down each victim with a .223 caliber semi-automatic rifle. Prosecutors described how he spared only one, his 10-year-old son, Sean. The state presented dozens of witnesses. Among the most emotionally devastating testimony came from Sean himself, who testified via closed-circuit video. He calmly told the court, "My dad came through the door and shot my mom." He described the chaos, how he ducked behind a counter, fled the house barefoot, and ran to a neighbor's door for help. EMTs and Osage County deputies gave grim details about what they saw that night. Deputy Nathan Perling testified that when he arrived, Dorothy White was sitting in a recliner, bleeding from her abdomen. Upstairs, 16-year-old Lauren lay writhing in pain. She said, "Don't let me die," Perling told the court. And she said her father shot her. The crime scene photos, shell casings, and 911 recordings provided physical evidence to support the survivor accounts. Karen's divorce attorney, Dan Pingelton, confirmed that Karen had filed for a protection order in March 2009. She had written that she feared Craig and described his forceful and mean behavior, noting how she had complied with unwanted sexual demands just to avoid confrontations. Then came the testimony of Sonny Reese, Karen's friend and romantic partner. Reese, subpoenaed by both prosecution and defense, described the marriage as very abusive. She told the jury that Karen was terrified of Craig and that their relationship had grown toxic long before their separation. The defense, led by attorney Tom Haney, did not deny that Craig committed the murders. Instead, Haney framed the killings as the breaking point of a man suffering from major depressive disorder, delusions, and severe emotional trauma triggered by his wife's affair and the custody battle over their children. Haney argued that Craig's unraveling mental state had left him legally insane at the time of the shootings. To support this, Haney called psychiatrist Dr. Stephen Peterson, who testified that Kayla was suffering from such extreme depression that he was incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. He presented evaluations suggesting that Craig had experienced hallucinations and was obsessed with reclaiming his broken family, even if it meant destroying it. But the prosecution hit back with its own expert, Dr. William Logan, a forensic psychiatrist, who stated that Kayla did not meet the threshold for legal insanity under Kansas law. Logan argued that Kayla knew his actions were wrong, evidenced by the fact that he fled the crime scene, hid the rifle, which was never recovered, and evaded police for over 13 hours. In closing arguments, Hanley reminded the jury this was methodical. He had a plan. He brought a weapon, extra magazines, gloves, even trail mix for the road. This wasn't a man out of his mind, this was a man out for revenge. The defense countered with one final plea: Craig Kahler didn't wake up that day intending to kill. After nearly 2 weeks of testimony and over 70 witnesses, the fate of James Craig Kahler was in the jury's hands. As the jurors filed out of the courtroom to begin deliberations, the tension inside Osage County District Court was suffocating. Families of the victims sat in silent prayer, while Craig Kahler sat still, eyes locked on the floor. It had been nearly 2 years since the brutal murders of Karen Kahler, her daughters Emily and Lauren, and her grandmother Dorothy White. The evidence had been laid bare. Now it was time for justice. The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours, a brief window given the complexity of the case and the gravity of what was at stake. When they returned, the courtroom stood silent as the verdict was read: guilty on all counts. Craig Kahler was convicted of capital murder, 4 counts of first-degree murder, and 1 count of aggravated burglary. Kahler showed no emotion. He stood motionless, dressed in a dark suit, as the bailiff confirmed his fate. His parents, seated behind him, remained stoic. On the other side of the courtroom, members of Karen Kahler's family quietly wept. But the trial wasn't over. The jury now had to decide whether Craig Kahler would live or die. The sentencing phase began immediately after the verdict. Prosecutors argued that the heinous and premeditated nature of the crime warranted the death penalty. Assistant Attorney General Amy Hanley emphasized the cruelty of the killings. He didn't just kill his wife. He killed his daughters. He gunned down an 89-year-old woman. There is no redemption here. This was pure, calculated evil. Karen's surviving family members were given the opportunity to speak. Her brother took the stand, his voice trembling, and spoke about the destruction left in Craig's wake. He described the daughters. Emily, a college freshman full of ambition, and Lauren, a bright high school junior, murdered by the very man who was supposed to protect them. Then came testimony from the defense. Haney continued to argue that Kahler had snapped under emotional and psychological pressure, and that his mental illness rendered him incapable of fully understanding his actions. He called character witnesses, including former co-workers and family members, who described Kahler as a loving father and respected professional until his marriage crumbled. The defense introduced mitigating factors. Kahler had no prior criminal record, had served his community for years, and had been diagnosed by multiple professionals with major depressive disorder. But prosecutors were unrelenting. They reminded the jury of Kahler's behavior in the days leading up to the killings, his planning, purchasing of ammunition, the presence of survival gear, and his chilling calmness after the crimes. After a full day of deliberations, the jury returned again. This time, they delivered a unanimous recommendation: death. It was the ultimate punishment for one of the most chilling crimes in Kansas history. Kahler would become the 10th man on Kansas death row. Although the state had not executed anyone since 1965, the sentence was clear: society had no place for someone who could commit such a ruthless, calculated massacre. District Judge Philip from formalized the sentence in October 2011. As he read the judgment, he noted the overwhelming weight of the evidence, the horror of the crime, and the pain inflicted upon not just one family, but an entire community. Kahler's defense team quickly announced their intention to appeal. They would argue that Kansas's narrow insanity laws violated due process and that Kahler's mental illness should have precluded a death sentence. The Kahler trial left lasting scars. The town of Burlingame, population barely 900, had never experienced anything like it. Neighbors who remembered Dorothy White as a saint and the Kahler girls as kind, sweet, and polite struggled to comprehend the violence. "It still doesn't feel real," one former teacher said during a memorial for the girls. "To know that someone you trusted, that a father could do this." The house where the murders occurred was sold, renovated, and quietly resettled. The crime scene photos, once public, were sealed by request of the family. Kahler was moved to El Dorado Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison that houses Kansas's death row inmates. He now spent his days alone in a cell, awaiting what might be years of legal appeals. But in the eyes of the jury and the families, justice had been served. 2020, in a 6-3 decision, the court sided with Kansas. And the debate over Kayla versus Kansas continues, not just in courtrooms, but in the moral conscience of the nation. Subscribe to Worldwide Crime Time for full case deep dives, true crime breakdowns, and true crimes that shocked the world.